Good afternoon, or morning or evening, depending on where you are. Hello to all participants. My name is Galit Shmueli, and in the next 20 minutes, I'll be presenting our paper on information quality, which is forthcoming in JRSSA with a discussion. This paper is co-authored with Ron Kennett, who will speak after me. First of all, I'd like to thank the Royal Statistical Society for inviting us to deliver this first solo Journal Club event. I'm very excited to do it. I also like to thank Shirley Coleman for the introductions. This is a truly global event. I'm currently located in the Kingdom of Bhutan, while Ron Kennett is in Israel, Shirley and the RSS staff are in the UK, and we have participants from all over the world. Before I begin, let me describe the InfoQ idea in a nutshell. If you've ever conducted an empirical study, you must have asked yourself at various stages of the study whether the data that you have actually has the potential to address the question you're trying to answer or the problem you're trying to address. While this querying is a natural and integral part of data analysis, it's not been formalized and it's usually not taught, to the best of our knowledge, neither in statistics departments or in other data sciences disciplines. So in this paper, we attempt to formalize the question: what one should consider in order to address this question? What are dimensions for assessing the level of information quality in a study? This work is conceptual, where we set up a framework, and hopefully this will serve as a start for more empirical developments. I'm moving on to slide 2. To motivate the need for formalizing this concept of information quality, or InfoQ, let's think of the following scenario. Suppose that you can access or receive or purchase a huge data set from eBay, the online auction website. This data is going to have information on millions of auctions that are already closed. Suppose you need to choose between different data options. You can choose all the camera auctions in 2008, or all the future camera auctions that will occur in 2015. You can choose auctions for all the items, not only cameras, in a certain month, say January of 2012, or you can take a sample of all types of different auctions in the entire year of 2012. The question is, which one of these would you choose, and how much is it worth to you, or how much will you pay? Maybe eBay data is not even what you're looking for. Maybe you want something else. This little chart at the bottom shows how eBay has actually started decreasing in terms of visitor traffic, and Craigslist, which is a second-hand type of website, has been going up. So of course the answer is depending on what we're trying to do. In other words, to answer this question of which data set you want and how much it's worth to you, you must know the goal of the study, its context, its intended analysis, what are the capabilities, and what are the constraints. Slide 3 presents the question that we're therefore trying to formalize. What is the potential of a data set to generate knowledge? Now this is a little bit general, so we're going to make it a little more pointed. This question arises at various stages of the data analysis, at the pre-data collection step, at the post-data collection, or even after the analysis is done. David Hand, in his book Statistics: A Very Short Introduction, says, statisticians working in a research environment may well have to explain that the data are inadequate to answer a particular question. As slide 4 shows, there are 4 components that we must consider in order to evaluate the potential of the data to address the problem of interest. We have the analysis goal, which we denote by G. X is the available data set. F is a data analysis method, a particular one, or a set of analyses that we have in mind. And U is a utility measure. I'll elaborate on each component next, and then we'll put the pieces back together to arrive at the InfoQ definition. Let's move on to slide 5. Slide 5. By analysis goal, we mean the translation of the domain goal into an analytic framework. The data analyst must know the what, why, when, where, how, and all these different questions of the domain problem in order to effectively translate it into a data answerable problem. We all know that that's a very difficult part of the data analysis. For example, credit card fraud detection might be translated into an anomaly detection goal that would ask us flag unusual credit card transactions within 24 hours of a person's last transaction. Determining factors that affect the final price of an auction could be translated into a causal goal of testing the effect of a given set of causal variables on the auction price. If you recall the eBay dataset example, that's the context I'm talking about. The analysis goal must be specified with sufficient accuracy and detail as to avoid answering the wrong question. For example, we need to define the goal as either causal explanatory, in other words, we're trying to explain something, or else it's predictive, we're trying to predict some empirical variable, or maybe it's descriptive. In our paper, we describe various goals that have been pursued in online auction research, where some studies seek causal knowledge, others a predictive algorithm, and yet others are in search of a population parameter, which would fall under a descriptive goal. Using Deming's distinction, we should consider whether the goal is enumerative or analytical. And Tukey's exploratory versus confirmatory distinction is another dimension to consider. The quality of information, or information quality, depends on the quality of each of the four components that we mentioned: goal, data, analysis, and utility. In the case of the goal, incorrect specification can be considered low quality of goal specification. For example, Kimball uses the term error of the third kind, giving the right answer to the wrong question. And many of you are probably familiar with Tukey's famous saying, far better an approximate answer to the right question, which is often vague, than an exact answer to the wrong question, which can always be made precise. Slide 6. The data component refers to the particular data set of interest. So we're not talking about data in general, but we're referring to a particular data set. If you recall the beginning of the talk, I mentioned the hypothetical scenario of purchasing an eBay dataset with different options. InfoQ is affected by the quality of the dataset and by its relationship to the goal, analysis, and utility measures. In particular, consider the data source, the data type, and the size and dimension of the data. The dataset can come from different sources in terms of who collected it and for what purpose. That's what we call primary data versus secondary data, whether the data come from an observational study or from an experiment. Is it coming from a single or multiple sources, etc., etc. In the eBay example, for the purpose of predicting prices of future auctions, we could use secondary data that's observational, so we'd purchase old data from eBay. The source must match the predictive scenario as much as possible, so the timing of our data set is important. In other words, when I say old, it really shouldn't be very old. The type of data is also very relevant to its potential to achieve the specified analysis goal. Do we need to predict the exact auction price or a price interval? In other words, should we work in the numerical outcome land, or do we need to dichotomize it, or perhaps work in multiple categories? Should we consider textual reviews of a seller, or maybe network type information on similar auctions? All these refer to the data type. The data size and dimension will affect aspects such as the data extraction and cleaning, and of course, analysis time. It will affect the richness and the dirtiness of the data, and of course, other features as well. There exists a rich literature on what's called data quality, which is obviously relevant to the InfoQ question. This literature has a few streams. Colin Mallows coined the term zeroth problem. How do the data relate to the problem, and what other data might be relevant? That's one aspect of the quality of the data, and that is the quality of the data given the goal, which is denoted by U, the utility of the data, X, given or conditional on the goal. A different type of data quality is what is used in databases or in management information systems, and there they ask about the usefulness of queried data to the person querying it. So there again, we have a certain goal in mind, the person has a goal, and we're asking about the utility of the data X given G. And finally, many formal statistics organizations and international organizations talk about quality of statistical data, and they talk about summary statistics that are usually obtained either through surveys or other similar mechanisms for a particular goal, We'll get back to these quality of statistical data measures later on. The theme throughout these three types of data quality dimensions is that, again, they look at X and G and the utility of X conditional on G. Slide 7. The third InfoQ component is the data analysis method. And by method, we include any data analytic approach, be it statistical of any type, parametric, semi-parametric, classic Bayesian, etc. Or it can be a data mining algorithm, simulation, optimization, as long as the method is intended to be applied to the data set for answering the question of interest. We call it a data analysis method. The quality of the data analysis is determined by adequate choice and implementation of methods. Godfrey comments, poor models and poor analysis techniques, or even analyzing the data in a totally incorrect way. Of course, the quality of the analysis depends on the expertise of the analyst and on software availability. In fact, analysis quality is probably the focus of statistics education. Slide 8 describes the fourth component of InfoQ, which is a utility measure. Like the goal, this measure ties together the domain and the analytic context. Determining the utility of the analysis from the domain point of view requires an understanding of the what, why, how, etc. of how the analysis results will be used. Given the domain, a utility measure or measures is chosen. The data and analysis are then geared towards optimizing this measure. Here, when we talk about quality, we're talking about adequate metrics from the analysis standpoint and also adequate metrics from the domain standpoint and the translation from one to the other. Moving to slide 9, we now move to the formal definition of InfoQ, which ties the four components of goal, data, analysis, and utility together. Verbally, we define InfoQ as the potential of a particular data set to achieve a particular goal using a given empirical analysis method. More formally, we define it as the domain utility, U, of data analysis method F that uses data X given a goal G. And that is the notation that we have right here in the middle of this slide. This is our definition of the InfoQ concept. But how does it fit into the larger field of statistics? On the next slide, slide 10, we'll look at this relationship. Slide 10. The field of statistics offers methodologies for increasing InfoQ at various stages of a study. At the study design stage, we have statistical literature on how to design experiments and clinical trials, how to design a survey and take samples, how to design computer experiments, etc. Statistical principles for increasing InfoQ are principles such as randomization, stratification. In clinical trials, we use blinding and placebo. Then we have blocking and replication, sampling frames, and linking data collection protocols with appropriate designs. So the field of statistics definitely has methodologies and tools for increasing InfoQ at the pre-data collection stage. The statistics literature also offers methods for increasing InfoQ after the data have been collected, whether the data were collected in a way that adheres to the statistical principles or not. Methods exist for detecting and addressing missing and extreme values. It's interesting to note that sometimes unclean data have higher InfoQ than clean data. For example, missing data in financial statements can be useful for predicting fraudulent reporting. So once again, very dependent on the goal and on the context. In our paper, we describe the different statistical methods under the umbrella of InfoQ increasing approaches. Thus far, I introduced the InfoQ concept and definition. The next natural and practical question is how to operationalize InfoQ so that it can be measured in practice. After all, our original motivation was to determine the utility of an actual data set for achieving a goal of interest using a data analysis method. The next slide, slide 11, is about InfoQ assessment. Slide 11. To operationalize InfoQ, we followed the classical approach of breaking down the construct or concept into dimensions. In particular, we came up with the following 8 dimensions: data resolution, data structure, data integration, temporal relevance, chronology of data and goal, generalizability, construct operationalization, and communication. Let me just mention that these dimensions turn out to be related to a few other contexts that also need to operationalize a construct. For example, in big data, we have what's known as the 3 V's that characterize data: volume, variety, and velocity. Notice that these 3 V's do not consider a particular goal, an analysis, or utility. They just characterize the data, X. In marketing research, data quality is evaluated by what's called recency, accuracy, availability, and relevance. Here, they do consider the data and the goal. In other words, both big data and marketing research data dimensions exclude the data analysis component, F. The closest to InfoQ is the quality of statistical data context, which we mentioned earlier, which is used by international and official statistics organizations. These dimensions are aimed at assessing whether statistical summaries, such as unemployment estimates, are useful for the purpose they were collected for. We'd consider this a special case of InfoQ where F, or the data analysis, is restricted to summary statistics and where the goal is inference. Next, I'd like to elaborate on each InfoQ dimension. Slide 12 introduces the first dimension called data resolution, which refers to the measurement scale and the level of aggregation of the data. This is not a data-only dimension, as we must consider the scale and aggregation level conditional on the goal at hand. For example, a few years ago, researchers showed that keyword search data from Google, where users search for flu-related keywords, provides an earlier signature of a flu outbreak compared to traditional data collected by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, in the USA. But what are the scale and aggregation levels of the data? The CDC data are typically weekly. Google's search data can be finer, daily, maybe even hourly. But should we work with daily data? Weekly? Hourly? What keywords should be included? What geographical areas can be defined? All these are data resolution considerations that affect InfoQ. Slide 13. Data structure relates to the usefulness of the type of data and its characteristics, but once again with respect to the goal. In the eBay example that I mentioned at the start of the talk, different datasets can be purchased or extracted. Do we want time series? Do we want network data? Geographical information? While big data offers more options, it's the analyst's job to determine what data are potentially useful. Given the huge investment in cleaning and processing the data, choosing the right data is really important. Moving on to slide 14, in apropos big data, the availability of data from multiple disparate sources has added a new layer to the utility of data analysis. While many companies now advocate combining data from traditional systems and social media, the question is, for what purpose? The data integration dimension looks at the potential utility of integrating data from different sources. In addition to benefits, one must also consider losses and dangers, such as privacy issues. The fourth InfoQ dimension, shown on slide 15, is temporal relevance. Here we consider the timeline of the goal, data, analysis, and deployment, or analysis usage. Consider the timeliness of the data collection stage. In some studies, fast collection is essential, while in others, it is not. The time between the data collection and the data analysis is another interval whose importance is goal-dependent. Sometimes the data analysis duration itself is critical if the developed model will be used in real time for providing immediate user feedback. A 24-hour MCMC algorithm is probably inappropriate. And lastly, the duration between data analysis and deployment time can also be critical or completely unimportant. To evaluate this InfoQ dimension, therefore requires us to consider the entire analysis timeline, determine the importance of the duration of each component given the goal. Slide 16 describes the fifth InfoQ dimension called chronology of data and goal. Whereas the temporal relevance looked at time durations, here we look at the ordering and sequence of the data components relative to the goal. Depending on the study goal, different data components must be available or set up in a certain sequence. For example, consider the auctions again. In studies aimed at determining the drivers of auction price, which are often based on auction theory, the number of bidders plays a major role as an independent variable. In contrast, for the purpose of forecasting the price of an ongoing auction, we can't use the number of bidders as a predictor since it's unknown until the auction close. In a time series context, this is even more obvious. Suppose you collect daily weather forecasts for a year. For a study whose goal is to reverse engineer the forecasts, these data might be insufficient, as you'll need other weather information. Even if it is, we must make sure to use only values from previous days to generate future forecasts. In contrast, if the goal is to impute missing forecast values, then we could potentially use a smoothing method, which would use past and future daily values to impute the weather forecasts on a given day. On slide 17, we get to the InfoQ dimension of generalizability. We consider two types of generalizability: the statistical sample to population generalization and the scientific version, where we generalize the results from a study to other contexts. To determine InfoQ, we must figure out what type of generalizability is needed and whether the data, analysis, and utility measures are set up properly. A sample of eBay auctions can be used to estimate consumer surplus on eBay in a certain year, or it can be used to derive a model for auction pricing in online auctions in general. Slide 18 describes the dimension of construct operationalization. Constructs are abstractions that describe a phenomenon of theoretical interest. Measurable data are an operationalization of underlying constructs. For example, stress can be operationalized and measured in different ways. We can use physiological measures, responses to a questionnaire, self-reported symptoms, etc., etc. Constructs play an important role in explanatory models that are based on underlying causal theories. In such cases, we can operationalize a certain construct in different ways, and that would be valid. In contrast, in studies that focus on measurable data, such as predicting the frequency of headaches, the choice of operationalized variable is critical. Self-reported depression levels can't replace headache information. In considering InfoQ, we therefore must evaluate the alignment of the goal with the available data. Slide 19. The last InfoQ dimension is called communication. This relates to any form of communication where the analysis results are presented to a stakeholder. In industry, reports and presentations are common. In academia, journal papers, conference, and seminar talks are the main medium. Even if the goal is correctly specified, the data and the analysis are appropriate and insightful. If the results are not communicated effectively, the utility of the data is lost. The Challenger shuttle and tragedy are an extreme example. However, it's not uncommon that miscommunicating study results, intentionally or unintentionally, lead to disasters. A recent example that was in the news was an Excel spreadsheet mistake that affected policymaking in the US. Let's look at that for a minute. Slide 20. This story appeared in the National Public Radio program Marketplace on April 17 this year. In the last 3 years, there has been a concerted effort by those in Washington to reduce government spending and rein in the national debt. One reason for the budget cuts? Research by two Harvard economists, Ken Rogoff and Carmen Reinhart. The pair found that when a country owes more than 90% of their GDP, it slides into recession. They later tell the story. Fixing this Excel error transforms high-debt countries from recession to growth. You can read more about it by going to the link at the bottom. But essentially, this story illustrates the power of communication, miscommunication, and in informing the stakeholder at the right time. The Excel error was detected only after the researchers made their spreadsheet available, but it was too late because policymaking was influenced by these results. Efforts to make data used in academic publications publicly available are therefore an important InfoQ increasing factor. Hopefully this session provides adequate communication of our forthcoming JRSSA paper. Slide 21. In this talk, I've briefly described the InfoQ framework and the 8 dimensions that we can use for operationalizing InfoQ for purpose of evaluation and practice. How to measure InfoQ is a challenging question. In the paper, we proposed a few approaches, the main one being based on an InfoQ score. The overall InfoQ score is a combination of scores on each of the 8 dimensions. Obviously, it's a subjective score, and there's therefore a need to create an explicit guideline for how to score. Towards this effort, we implemented the rating-based approach in 2 research methods courses. The first was a PhD program at the University of Ljubljana in Slovenia, where students were preparing their research proposals. Each student was requested to evaluate his or her proposal on the 8 InfoQ dimensions and to determine whether the proposal was likely to lead to the intended goal. The second study was implemented at Carnegie Mellon University's. Students were instructed to read reports on 5 completed studies. They evaluated the 8 dimensions for each of the studies after reading a short description of InfoQ and its dimensions. These experiences highlighted the usefulness of the InfoQ approach, which students found revealing and useful. We also learned that more work is needed to further streamline the scoring procedure, as there was quite a bit of heterogeneity across different raters on the same items. Assessing InfoQ is therefore an important topic that requires further research and testing. Slide 22 concludes this presentation. The motivation behind developing the InfoQ framework was to try and streamline the question regarding the value of a dataset. Management is often reluctant to invest resources in obtaining data. Why should we invest in data? And more importantly, in which data should we invest? These are all legitimate questions. Another use of InfoQ in industry, as in academia, is in prioritizing projects or studies. Researchers and graduate students can use InfoQ to compare and contrast the value of potential datasets for their research. The strong connectivity between the domain and analytics within the InfoQ framework means that InfoQ serves as an important bridge between academia and practice by strengthening the functional analytics relationship. As in any new methodological framework, there is still lots to develop and assess. As I mentioned, InfoQ Assessment is one important direction for future work. In the paper, we also discuss alternative assessment approaches, and these too require further research. While we presented 8 dimensions, by no means are these exhaustive or complete. There could arise additional dimensions that affect InfoQ and should be integrated into this framework. One example, which is relevant in some scenarios, is that of data privacy. Another is human subjects compliance and risk. Lastly, the technological advances in data collection, storage, transfer, and analysis affect InfoQ in various and sometimes opposing ways. Perhaps use of technology should be another dimension to consider. With this, I close my presentation and look forward to your questions. Thank you.